Brendan Dillon looks set to test free agency, which isn't ideal for the Jets, but perhaps is what the team needs. We'll dive into all of that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. As always, thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, like I said, we're kicking off with a pretty interesting lineup of discussion points, probably some stuff that's going to hurt just a little bit for some of you who are big Brendan Dillon fans. But of course, you know, as it is, time moves on, and sometimes players have to depart despite being pretty good contributors. And I think that's where I'm sort of at with Brendan Dillon, who is now rumored to be testing free agency. We'll dive into the implications of that in just a moment. Before we get further, though, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more, because right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Now, like I said, for the Jets, obviously, Winnipeg's roster is going to have a bit of a makeover this offseason, whether it's just letting guys go or promoting some young talent, perhaps even acquiring some new players, which I have a lot of feelings about, and we'll talk about some free agents and stuff that maybe Winnipeg should avoid here towards the end of the episode. But one guy that I think wouldn't really be somebody that should necessarily be avoided, but perhaps should not be prioritized to bring back, is Brendan Dillon. And I feel really strange saying that because he's one of the few expiring free agents that I think has been a fantastic contributor to the Jets. It's really rare that I say Winnipeg should let a UFA go that's been as good as Dillon has. And I think it really should be prefaced that if he came back on a reasonable contract, I really wouldn't have any problems. I'd be pretty okay with that. In fact, I'd arguably even be happy about that. But I think for what Dillon is going to look for and what the Jets probably need to do with some of the roster consolidation and opening up spots for some of their young players, unfortunately, the Jets have a lot more left-sided depth than they do on the right side. And so unless Dillon suddenly becomes a right-handed expert or a right side expert, which he's not, there's just not really a great fit here where the Jets can afford to give him a healthy contract, especially at his age. He is a little bit on the older side, and I think with, likely age-related decline over the next few years and the fact that the Jets have talked a lot about getting younger and getting faster and focusing perhaps more on some young internal players and prospects who might be able to step into the lineup, I think for all of those reasons, Dillon was sort of destined to be one of the odd guys out. And it's not really because he didn't live up to his potential. In fact, he was great for the Jets. Like I said, I want to keep hammering home that point. He was awesome for what Winnipeg needed. And really, this is more just a business decision and a long-term development decision than it is anything to suggest that Dillon wasn't good enough for this team. He was great. And I think whoever he goes to next is going to love him. I think he'll be a fan favorite. If he goes to Vancouver, I think Canucks fans will enjoy what he does. I think he's a great player, and really this has nothing to do with his performance so much as it is just needing to change some things up stylistically and give you some roster flexibility while opening up a free spot on the left side and also arguably passing on the mantle to Sandberg. I think Dillon has more than proven that he is capable of top 4 minutes. He's been a great steadying presence on the left side, arguably one of our top two defenders on the team. And with him continuing to grow in importance on this team, continuing to take on more and more responsibility, it just makes sense that this is the handoff that you see. And again, like I said, really no slight against Dillon. And I know I keep saying that, but I really feel like I want to say it because I think it says a lot about the kind of player and character he was. He's been a great, great guy for the Jets. And I think it's actually a pretty big void for somebody to step in and fill, a guy who can really be a steadying presence on the left side and who at times has even been able to help Pionk handle some of his assignments a little bit better. Now, as much as I do love him, like I said, I think it's probably time for the Jets to look internally. Heinola is probably ready to step into a third pair role. Sandberg is ready to take on the number 2 mantle, and you've already got your number 1 left side sorted out. So, really the biggest question is how you handle the right side. And I think for that, the Jets are going to need some cap flexibility. My guess is they might have to make a trade for somebody because there's not really many free agents that I think are going to satisfy what Winnipeg is looking for. And like I said, there's a few guys that I want to talk about the Jets needing to avoid later this episode. And that's going to include some defenders, if we're being honest. There are plenty of guys out there who could probably fit the mold, but the Jets are most likely looking to do some stuff internally first, and then they'll sort out how to handle the right side, especially if they maybe process a buyout or two. Obviously, I think Pionk is probably not going anywhere, so my guess is it's looking more like Nate Schmidt might get bought out, but maybe Winnipeg runs it back for one more year just to let those contracts expire so that they don't add additional dead cap hits in the years following. I don't know. I think Winnipeg has plenty of options here. I honestly think a buyout really wouldn't be too much of a bad decision to make. I think doing so for at least one of their defenders would be a good idea because it opens up some flexibility this offseason to try and move some stuff around. So, for the Jets, lots of options, lots of movement, and unfortunately, it just means that you are going to lose 1 or 2 quality players, and I think Dillon's probably one of the best players that we've ever had go into free agency. But the other thing that is also worth acknowledging is that as he's getting older, his style is very physical. He was not really the fleetest of foot to begin with, and so as his age starts to maybe catch up to him a bit, you do wonder how much longer he can keep doing this. I mean, Dylan DeMello is a little bit younger, and look at how his game has kind of progressed. He is starting to get up there in years. He's been a great, great player for Winnipeg, but, as a defender, I think, the lack of foot speed on DeMello has kind of been noticeable. I think his ability to keep up with some of the play has declined a bit, and I just think with how things are moving for Winnipeg, prioritizing guys who are a bit more fleet of foot, a little more mobile, and on the younger side who can start to grow with this team would probably be one of the best decisions to make. And I know that does technically include Logan Stanley in that category, but I think we all know that the Jets should probably part ways with him rather than keep him around. So lots of fun stuff, but of course the Jets have any number of decisions to make over the next few weeks and months. It's going to be a busy offseason, and if the Jets are really serious about getting this right, this is a really crucial time for Winnipeg to take stock and inventory of what they've got in the team and make sure that they don't commit themselves to something that's not really worth investing in, which is part of the free agent to avoid list. We'll get into that later. But before we head into that, I also wanted to talk a little bit about last night's Saturday's Cup Finals game number 1. It's last night as of this recording because I am recording on a Sunday, but, the game last night still fresh in my mind. Thought I'd focus a little bit on that for just a few minutes. But before we head too much further, though, just wanted to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. Summertime means baseball, the NBA Finals, and more, and you can bet it all on FanDuel. Obviously, for those of you who are following the Cup Finals, like I was just talking about, the Oilers are facing off against the Panthers, and now that the Panthers have won Game 1, suddenly you find yourself looking at some pretty good odds for a Cup Finals favorite. But perhaps you think the Oilers have a few tricks up their sleeve. If you're really willing to put your money where your mouth is and win big, you should do so with FanDuel, because right now new customers can get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 that you can use to bet on everything from Finals MVP to who's going to hit one out of the park, all with FanDuel. Maybe you're looking for a hat trick in this Stanley Cup Finals. Maybe you're thinking that somebody's going to hit a grand slam for your favorite Toronto Blue Jays, or perhaps another baseball team you root for. Obviously, I'm an Orioles fan, so I guess for me that'd be like Gunnar Henderson or something. No matter what, though, be sure to visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started and add a big victory to your summer bucket list. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are just wrapping up, not really wrapping up, but moving on to talking about some thoughts from game number 1 of the Stanley Cup Finals. Obviously, for a lot of us, we perhaps have a rooting interest here in Paul Maurice. Also, some former Jets. You've got Dmitry Kulikov in this series. That's pretty fun. He's actually playing in the Cup Finals, which I don't think I ever really anticipated happening, but somehow it is. It's a shame it wasn't with Winnipeg, though. But regardless of who you're voting for, maybe you think you prefer the Oilers because they're a Canadian team that might bust up the Cup drought for Canada. Can't imagine a lot of you are really on that, but maybe some of you are. Before we dive into what I've thought of Game 1, though, just wanted to let you know, for those of you who are ESPN or Fox Sports watchers, if you find yourself having to turn down the volume because there's too much shouting, you should make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you daily to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every. Now, like I said, Game 1 between the Panthers and Oilers kicked off, and obviously Edmonton ended up losing a very close game. I think if you're a Panthers fan, you're probably feeling pretty fortunate that it panned out the way that it did. Let's be real, right? Edmonton was the much better team. I think the Oilers controlled everything from 5v5 to even some special teams play. But the single biggest reason that the Oilers lost was that Sergei Bobrovsky decided he was going to pull a full Hellebuck and go absolutely insane for a game. This was one of the best individual goaltending performances we've seen in the playoffs, and there's been a handful. But by every statistical model, whether it was was it Money Puck or Puckopedia's deserve to win-o-meter or expected goals models, whatever you want to say, Edmonton had the clear and decisive advantage. Even from just like a shot clock perspective, the Oilers almost doubled shots on Florida. So it was a pretty crazy game, and Bobrovsky made tough reads on scramble, goalmouth plays, deflections, tips, whatever it was. He somehow just had it, and it's amazing to say that because you look at his career and how the last few years have gone. And Bobrovsky was sort of on the outs, it seemed. He's 35, 36 now. And, until recently, he wasn't even the starter. This past season, he finally got his spot back. But you think about how he got to this point, and it looked like more than anything, he might be needing to retire at some point. And instead, Bobrovsky has apparently turned back the clock to his prime years. He's been almost unbeatable during the postseason. And you marry that with a really good Panthers team that has generally played really well throughout much of the playoff run. And it's a bit of a match made in heaven. It's something that I don't think Paul Maurice had in the Magical Jets Cup run, where, both parts of the team worked really well. The goaltending from Hellebuck, that series or that Cup run was solid, but perhaps not spectacular when you needed it to be. And here, the Panthers have both a really good team in front of Bobrovsky and Bobrovsky playing excellent hockey. I know last Cup Finals, he did kind of slow down towards the middle point of the series, but it seems like this year he's locked in. I don't know what it is, but this dude is just on another planet. And with the Panthers having some really big contract, expirations coming up, including, Sam Reinhart, that's a big deal to really try and push for this victory. And to survive Game 1 and get through it is a tremendously helpful thing, right? Obviously, winning Game 1 for any playoff series massively increases the odds that you come out on the other side. But more than anything, I think it shows that you can play poorly and still come out of this series with a huge victory. Both of Florida's goals, without the net pulled or without the goalie pulled, came off of a Nurse CC pairing mistake. We saw, I think, Nurse or CC get rubbed out along the wall for the second goal against, and the first goal was a Verhaeghe thing where I think CC turned like a decent odd man situation into almost like a 3-on-1, and that read where he crossed over was a really poor decision. He missed shutting down the crossing lane or the passing lane and ended up exposing Skinner to a super high danger chance that he really had no chance on. I know Skinner has gotten a lot of flack over the past couple of seasons for his playoff performances, but this time you really couldn't fault him for any of the goals that went in against him. He basically had no shot, and it would have taken a miracle for him to make those saves. So, for the Oilers, I'm sure it's incredibly frustrating, and it sort of feels like one of those games where, sure, it's only the first game and you've got 6 more opportunities to try and turn things around. But when you lose like this, it can be a morally dispiriting, crushing blow to your confidence, especially when you're talking about a Panthers team that played pretty poorly. I mean, they really didn't generate too many offensive opportunities. They had to be really opportunistic. And, you think about how they came off of like just a handful of mistakes from Edmonton, and you think to yourself, man, we still lost to that? Yikes. Not even getting, much of anything through Bobrovsky has to be a very frustrating experience. They had so many chances where there was an empty net, but somehow the puck just either went wide or they couldn't get it through a sea of bodies after that. Maybe they release a shot, guys, flop around and manage to cover the empty net. It didn't seem to matter. Whatever it was, there was just some sort of invisible force field preventing the Oilers from scoring. So as much as it does feel like a blow to the confidence, I guess the Oilers can probably take heart that they played really, really well. I think the biggest thing that I'm looking for is to see how the Panthers respond in game 2, because I don't think you want to play like that in the second opportunity against this Oilers team. You keep playing like that, and you are going to find yourself in some really bad straits here as you approach the midpoint of the series, especially once it goes back to Edmonton. Having Bobrovsky be able to steal you a game is nice, but I don't think you want to make a habit of that. You've got to show that you are a team at even strength that still plays really well and that's still capable of doing what it's done throughout most of the season against an Oilers offense that, look, it is top heavy, but that top heavy happens to have like 3 or 4 of the best players in the league. So you just have to be wary of that, be, confident in your ability to respond in a big way. Despite winning, I think I would actually be thinking the Panthers are the team that really needs to respond. They didn't play well. I'm sure Maurice was probably not thrilled with that performance. I know that they won, and that's the most important part, but how you get there sometimes is still a bit of a big deal, especially when you're not closing out the series. This is just the start of the Cup Finals. And so for Maurice, he's going to want to establish a clear improvement on, defensive commitment, offensive creation, transition. The Oilers were dancing around them repeatedly and pulling off some really great plays. And so for Edmonton, I think you just kind of keep doing what you're doing, and at some point, it'll probably start to pay off. For the Panthers, they're going to have a much, much, much better game than they did in the first opening of the series on Saturdays. So a lot of fun stuff to consider. I guess if you're a Panthers fan, you're still feeling pretty good. You remember that Paul Maurice coached a Jets team that had games like these frequently against the Oilers, and they swept them, in 2021. So will history repeat itself? Probably not. I think the Panthers are likely to play pretty well, and I would expect the Oilers to at least win like 2 games in this series. But hey, crazier things have happened. Maybe this really is the Panthers team of destiny. Let me know your series predictions from the remaining games in the comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. I've got Panthers in 6 for what it is worth. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I wanted to spend the last few minutes of this episode talking about, free agents to avoid. I've talked about players that I want to sign, and there's some guys that I would actually prefer the Jets avoid, which is weird to say because, typically we focus on great free agents, but I think there are some guys who are actually pretty decent, but might be worth avoiding because of the fit and what the Jets need. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. Hey friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just wrapping up with some free agents to avoid, which is kind of a fun way to approach the free agent discussion. Usually we talk about guys the Jets should really go after, but these are players that perhaps have some decent value, but maybe just aren't really good fits for the Jets. The first two names are very obvious because we've talked about them a lot. It's Tyler Toffoli and Sean Monahan. As much as I think that they played really well during the regular season, during the playoffs, they were unfortunately pretty clear liabilities. Monahan less so. I thought Sean played okay, but he just wasn't great enough against Colorado. Toffoli, though, was basically a non-factor throughout much of the playoffs. It's a shame because I thought he would be a much better fit, and certainly during the regular season, both guys played pretty well, but unfortunately, when you really needed them to stand up the most and really show up in a big way, neither guy was really able to elevate their games beyond what you saw in the regular season. And in fact, I would say it was much worse than what we saw in the regular season. They just weren't really factors for much in any of these games at all. So really disappointing. I thought they were going to end up having much better playoff runs than they did, but it perhaps just really showed why the Jets needed to make a change this offseason and move in a different direction. Now, another guy that somebody in the comments has been asking about is Evgeny Kuznetsov, and I did reply to that, but the long and short of it is that Kuznetsov at this stage of his career is bad. I don't think he wants to be a fourth liner either. And for what, the Jets typically ask of their fourth line, which is to be a really solid, defensively minded, two-way attacking unit, he just doesn't fit. Like, I don't think that he really has much left in the tank. And I say this as somebody who's watched him for years. I did like him several years ago. I think that there was a version of him that was super fun, super dynamic, and a great player. But at this stage of his career, a lot of that magic just seems to have gone away. I think when you saw him with the Canes, there was a lot of fancy stick work, some really good skating and movement, but something that kind of stood out was how often it just didn't result in anything. He still has all of the flair and technical skill to be a very dynamic player, but the actual part of him converting that into, decent scoring chances, actual points, and quality link-up play with his teammates, it really didn't result in much. And maybe that's just a fault of the Canes, but I think it's been a thing with Kuzi for many, many years. And when he's in his own end, he's a huge liability, right? You're basically looking at an even less scoring a guy who has weaker scoring rates than Kyle Connor, who has many of the same defensive lapses and lack of 5v5 game that Connor does. So at this stage of his career, I just don't even know what he is. I think he's probably below replacement level, and it's a shame because there was a time when he was a good player, but at this stage, no. I would really stay away from that. I think you're going to find yourself really disappointed in what he does. And I know that he looks like a fun player, but in terms of any actual impact on the ice, it is negligible. Now, one player who's about to get a huge contract extension, and I think a lot of people keep suggesting the Jets should go after him, is Philip Hronek. And I got to say, right off the bat, stay away from Hronek. Hronek is a fun defender, and I think a guy who suits Quinn Hughes well. But Hronek is asking for 7 or 8 million, and I can just tell you he's not worth that. Hronek has traditionally been like a decent-ish second pairing guy, but I look at him as more of a Neil Pionk type that's going to eventually crash out. I think this season is a huge statistical anomaly from him, and the last thing you really want to do is bank a huge contract extension on a very short sample size, because prior to this, Hronek really wasn't all that impressive. In fact, there were seasons where he was just bad, and I think relying on Hughes having a Norris season and making Hronek look like a top pairing defender to be your sole source of evidence for a massive contract extension just doesn't feel like a very good chance, like a good gamble. Now, there is a chance it actually works out, but I don't think the Jets should be that kind of team to really pursue this. I don't even know if the Canucks are going to do it. They might have to trade his rights. He is a fun player, and I think that he can play a decent role, but I certainly would not want to be the team that finds out that, as 2 years into this contract, you're already thinking about a buyout. Winnipeg has generally had to avoid a lot of those over the years, and I think that they've dodged quite a few bullets. But Hronek, as tempting as it is to try and chase a really top pairing defender, he's not that guy. John Klingberg, also not that guy, and I think everyone sort of knows that, and at this point anyways, but Klingberg has really aged out, and I think it's shown ever since, the tail end of his Dallas days. He's just not the same guy that he used to be. There was a time when he was a dominant attacking top 4 defender, at times even top pairing. Those days are really far behind him, and as much as it would be nice to see him resurrect his career, I don't think he's going to be doing that with the Jets. So that's a free agent I'd avoid. Matt Dumba, also a guy to stay away from. Dumba really hasn't done much of anything recently, and with Tampa not really interested in bringing him back, and Dumba just not being that good anymore, I would say he is a huge pass. Defensively, not really impressive. Offensively, very little going on for him. So there's just not enough that he's bringing to the table other than being a bit chippy. So, yeah, unfortunate. There was a time that Dumba was more fun for the Wild, probably earlier in his career than where he is now. So, man, you look at the free agent pool and you just realize that there's not many players that are worth signing and giving, contracts to, which makes it very attractive for the Jets to make a trade rather than a free agent acquisition. That's where they should be focused anyways. Outside of drafting, I think trades are more likely what Winnipeg could win, because when it comes to spending money, the Jets are going to have to pay more than most teams to attract top free agent talent. And like a lot of these guys are, 28, 29, early 30s. Their best years are probably behind them. There's not many of these players that are going to be worth the huge contracts that some of them are going to be asking for. Manta might be one of the few that's of interest, and he probably wouldn't be too expensive, but I don't know what Manta's plans are anyways. He had a mediocre run with the Knights. I don't know if he's really interested in coming to Winnipeg, but if he is, and it's a reasonable contract ask, I would be a little more inclined to look at that. But, otherwise, there's just not a ton of centers or blue liners that are really worth chasing after. You're not really wanting to pick up a Jeff Carter or, a Scandella. Carter is retiring after this year, I hope. He's probably well past the expiration date, but somehow has managed to stick around despite being 40. One of the biggest guys that I would say the Jets really need to avoid, and the reason I'm saying this is because I think he's going to be one of the hottest commodities, it's Chandler Stevenson. Stevenson, at this stage of his career, he is basically like a bottom sixer. And the only reason that I think people still ascribe a top 6 role to him is because he keeps doing it for the Knights and because Stone was able to carry him for a long time. When he's away from Stone, or even sometimes when he's with him this year, it just wasn't very good. And I think you're starting to see why, for me, Stevenson was a fun fit alongside Mark, but not really somebody who creates much of his own offense. He's fast. He can pull off some decent finishes, but in terms of his own individual talent levels, he's not really on the level of a Mark Stone, and certainly not what the Jets are really asking for to fill that second-line center role. They need a really quality top 6 player, like a Middlestat or something, and unless one of those materializes somewhere that they can afford, I just don't think that a guy like Stevenson is really going to fill that role, especially because he's going to ask for a pretty big contract extension. It's the same thing that I think about Monahan, although I would say Monahan is arguably a better player, but because he's so slow, I feel like that is a bit of a knock against him. So, man, it's just a bit of a thin free agent market, but if the Jets could find a way to bring in somebody like, I don't know, Daniel Sprong or something, I would be pretty happy about that. There's a couple of other interesting names, but we've already covered them, so we'll have to keep an eye out to see if anyone else gets released or if there are some players who teams are interested in parting ways with. Sean Dirtsey might be worth a look if he decides to test free agency or something. Obviously, his rights are still controlled by Utah, but maybe he wants to sit it out and wait for another team to take a chance on him. Dirtsey is a very interesting player. I would like to see him in, a second pairing or third pairing role for the Jets. I think he could be what, we all hoped Neil Pionk would be. Dirtsey does have his moments where he's a little bit of a loose cannon, but if you're looking for a fun puck-moving, attacking-minded D who can pull off some pretty nice shots, Dirtsey could be a very interesting trade target if he's not really intending to stick around with Utah. But given that Utah is probably going to be a pretty good crowd, I don't think he has that much incentive to try and force his way out. So lots to consider, but for the Jets, plenty of names that I think Winnipeg should be staying far away from. Let me know your top trade targets, top free agent targets, or maybe, like me, which free agents and stuff you would prefer the Jets to avoid. Drop your thoughts in the comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets on Twitter. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you here tomorrow, so don't go anywhere. Have a great night, and as always, go Jets go.